Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Nick Dagan Best about the birth charts of Charlie Chaplin and Adolf Hitler, who are both time twins that were born with very similar charts and both responded very strongly to Venus retrograde periods because they were both born during Venus retrograde. So it ends up being an interesting study on what's called time twins, which is people who are born at the same time or people that were born with roughly the same birth chart. So, hey, Nick, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is a special study that you've done, especially with Venus retrogrades. And part of the genesis of this is that we're researching an episode right now. We're putting together an episode on the upcoming Venus retrograde in Aries that's about to take place this year in March and April of 2025. And these two are people, as we were putting together that research, that you've done presentations on before, because both of them were born during that same retrograde, and both of them had some of the most important turning points in their life take place under this retrograde that repeats every 8 years, essentially, right? And that's something you've come to specialize in with Venus retrograde periods.
Yeah, that's correct. And Chaplin and Hitler were two of the earliest examples I found that helped me sort of flesh out the system. I mean, what I was doing ultimately was sort of rediscovering Babylonian goal year periods in a way for my own, purposes. I didn't know they were called that. I had some vague idea that that's how astrology was done, that these synodic cycles of planets were used in a manner sort of like this, or presumably like this. So the idea being Venus being the easiest one. Venus has a synodic cycle of 8 years. So every 8 years, Venus makes pretty much a full return relative to the sun, position wise. And if you look at your solar return or anyone's solar return for their eighth birthday, their 16th birthday, any multiple of eight, Venus is always going to be very, very close to the natal position in those charts, in those solar return charts, and not just in the same zodiacal position, but relatively speaking, close to the same phase that the natal Venus is at. If someone's born, 2 months before a Venus retrograde, then every eighth birthday will be something like 2 months before a Venus retrograde.
Right. Or more simply, just that Venus retrograde is going to go retrograde in Aries in March this year, and eight
That's
years
right.
earlier, it also went retrograde in March in Aries in 2017. And then 8 years before that, it also went retrograde in Aries in March in 2009, and so on and
Yeah.
so forth in 8 year
Yeah.
increments pretty far back.
Yeah. 2001, 1993, 1985, 1977, 1969, 1961, 1953, 1945, so on and so forth. Yeah, with this regularity that you can follow. It's almost like a musical rhythm in the sense that it's very even and symmetrical, so it sets this very evenly lengthed period of time that you can follow over a person's lifetime or even longer.
All right. So one of the things I want to emphasize in this episode is we're putting together this episode, a big Venus retrograde episode on what's going to happen in terms of like mundane events in the world, because I think March and April timeframe looks like some major geopolitical events and other things like that. And we were researching like US history and Russian history and all these other histories of major things that have happened during these retrograde periods. But I also wanted to have a demonstration for people about how sometimes these Venus retrogrades can be personally relevant in a person's life, that they can coincide with important turning points, but also that they can sometimes connect events in that 8 year cycle so that some things that happen in your life during this upcoming Venus retrograde in March and April of 2025 may be connected to events that happened 8 years earlier in March and April of 2017, or 8 years before that in March and April of 2009, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to do a natal chart study. And I know one of the most compelling and impressive natal chart studies you've ever done was this one with Chaplin and Hitler, because both of them were born at the same time and both of them responded so strongly to this one specific Venus retrograde that kept occurring in 8 year increments for their entire lives.
Yeah, they were born 4 days apart. Charlie Chaplin had the sun in Aries and Hitler had the sun in Taurus, but they're born 4 days apart. Um, They did both have those funny little mustaches, which is, sort of interesting in and of itself. Um, they were both aware that they were born 4 days apart. There is a record of Chaplin talking to people and telling people when he was making this film, The Great Dictator. I mean, that's the thing, like Chaplin even kind of played him in a movie. And he told people that, I know what this guy was born 4 days after me. I know what he's like. I can play him in a movie. And Hitler was also apparently very aware, even in the 20s, that Chaplin was born close to his own date of birth. Um, the Great Dictator was banned in Germany during the war. It came out during the war, and Chaplin always went to his grave wondering what Hitler might have actually thought of it. Anyway, it's a really interesting connection between these two men, and the astrology is really very simple and easy to grasp. We're doing is using this one cycle of one planet to illustrate um, how this cycle was really a sort of a dominant figure in the timeline of both these men, each in their own way.
Right. And so Hitler obviously was like the became the leader of Germany and led Germany into World War II as well as the Holocaust, and then committed suicide at the end of the war as the Allies were invading Germany. And then Chaplin was a famous movie star that was like the highest paid actor in Hollywood at one point, right?
Yeah, well, more than just a movie star, he was also a film director, I mean, he was the whole operation, So yeah, he did it all. And even he was the co-founder of United Artists film studio, So he was also at some point he had a co-owner of a film studio. So he did a lot.
Got it. Okay. All right. So let's start at the beginning just with their birth charts to orient people. So here is the birth chart. We have time charts for both, roughly time charts for both of them, right?
Yeah, Chaplin gives his time of birth in his autobiography. He was born in England. His the childhood was quite rough, so he wasn't, he probably didn't carry around a long form birth certificate over his life. He spent time in workhouses and orphanages and things like that.
Yeah.
But that being said, he did have an older brother. He did, his mother lived to be fairly old, so that there were people around who could confirm the information. Um,
Okay.
with Hitler, we also have a time that's probably rounded off to the hour, but it's always worked, and every astrologer who's ever worked with this chart has used it. So I think that one's also quite solid. The source is good.
Cool. All right. So here's Hitler's chart. For those listening to the audio version, we're looking at a chart with Libra rising, and Venus is actually ruling the ascendant and is placed in Taurus, retrograde, in the eighth whole sign house, forming a close conjunction with Mars, a retrograde conjunction with Mars, which is also at 16 degrees of Taurus, conjoining Venus at 16 Taurus. Both of those two planets are squaring Saturn, which is at 13 degrees of Leo in the 11th whole sign house. He had a Moon Jupiter conjunction in Capricorn in the fourth house. His sun was in the very beginning of Taurus. He was born on April 20th, 1889. Mercury's on the descendant in Aries. And yeah, Uranus is in the rising sign, basically, not too far from the ascendant in the first house.
Hmm.
All right. So right away, that's kind of interesting that Hitler has Taurus rising potentially. He has Venus retrograde in Taurus. So
No,
there's
Taurus,
maybe,
Libra rising,
sorry,
Libra
Libra
rising, not
rising
yeah.
and Venus retrograde in Taurus. So maybe there's some reasons right away in terms of Venus being more important in his life, potentially as a timing factor, both in that he was born with Venus retrograde natally, but also has Libra rising, so Venus is ruling the ascendant, and then has a stellium of planets in Taurus, which is Venus's ruling sign.
Indeed, indeed. And, for his part, this is obviously someone who had some very kooky ideas about the world and humanity. Venus retrograde, in terms of as a transit, let alone in a person's nativity, one of the things it really signifies is people who want to sort of change the status quo. They're they're offended by the way things are done, and they feel that there's some fundamental change that needs to be applied. Um, and it can be anyone from any point in the political spectrum, including this charming fellow. So you get a sense of Venus. I mean, I guess like sort of the standard teaching about Venus in astrology is it's about, sort of love and peace and harmony, but it's also, jealousy and prejudice and rudeness and social exclusivity and a lot of other things that aren't nearly as sort of pleasant and presentable.
That's one of your keywords, though, is challenging the status quo for Venus retrogrades.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly how it functions as a transit. Just, what it does every 18 months is it brings certain things to the surface. It's sort of like it's when we all sort of start paying attention to how things are done and how they could be done differently. But you do get those sorts of people, those sorts of ideas. You'll see Chaplin in his own way certainly fell into that category as well, although not in the mass murder sense of the word.
Right. Although it's interesting, even with his prominent Venus for Hitler, that early on he was like a vegetarian painter, or like he had aspirations to be an artist earlier in his life, but ended up failing, and that didn't work out. And that's what
Yeah,
led to everything else.
yeah. The vegetarianism only started in 1931 with the death of his niece, but he was indeed he was an artist. He was turned down famously from an art school. He was mostly someone who sketched houses and buildings, and he made his living for a little while selling postcards. You know, People often ask the question, was he any good? He was perfectly good at drawing these little houses. Like he wasn't going to win any big awards, but he probably was good enough to be accepted into an art school. And, maybe he should have been.
All right, so that's Hitler, and then our other birth chart. So Hitler was born April 20th, 1889, and Charlie Chaplin was born April 16th, 1889, as you said, 4 days earlier at about 8
That's right.
p.m. in Walworth, London. Scorpio rising. The Venus-Mars conjunction is still very close. Venus is retrograde in Taurus at 18 degrees, applying to a conjunction with Mars at 13 degrees of Taurus, and they're both in the seventh house. In his chart, the moon is a few signs earlier. It's in Scorpio in the first house. Because the rising sign is different, the entire chart shifts so that Saturn in Leo is now in the 10th whole sign house. Um, the sun is earlier. It's fallen back into Aries. It's at 27 degrees of Aries in the sixth house, along with Mercury in the sixth. And Jupiter is now placed in the third whole sign house in Capricorn.
Yep.
All right. So this is Charlie Chaplin's chart. His with Scorpio rising, Mars is ruling it, but that Venus is still very prominent on an angle, retrograde in Taurus, and applying to that conjunction with Mars.
Hmm.
All right. So yeah, this is a good study for time twins. Also, just as an aside, because sometimes people like skeptics of astrology have classically raised that as an issue and said, well, what about two people who are born at the same time that have different destinies? And that's actually one of the weird things then that astrologers, when they actually study this issue, find out is that sometimes you do have these people that are born with similar charts that sometimes have weird parallels in their life, especially in terms of the timing of important events, because they would be having similar transits hit their chart around the same time. And that's basically what we're going to demonstrate here today.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, we've got two men with entirely different destinies. Both going to become world famous. They're both coming from virtually nothing in their lives, but one is going to make incredible art that still resonates with people today. I've shown Chaplin's films, in just in the last few years to my girl when she was, I don't know, 8, 9 years old, and she got it all. She laughed at every joke where she should have. Like it still hits. Um, at the same time, then you've got the other guy who also, did quite a bit, but not necessarily as productive, shall we say. Um, but yeah, both of them we're looking at both these men sort of reach those points in their lives. And it's just really the sort of the stages that are timed by the recurring returns of Venus. So we're following both of them at these 8-year intervals over the course of their life and seeing how doing that tells so much of the story that we know about them.
Right. So, why don't we start? Should we start biographically just about their lives? Because one of the things that was interesting as a parallel is they both had kind of difficult early lives, didn't they?
Yeah, Chaplin's life was like very rough, like Victorian London, rough. His mother battled with mental health problems. There were periods where Chaplin and his older brother Sidney were taken away by the state and placed in orphanages or workhouses and things like that. The father was out of the picture very early. Chaplin and his brother basically got into show business, to earn a living as kids. This is before we had, strict laws about these things, and maybe we'll be back to that again. So
Right.
yeah, very
The
very very hard childhood, working in theater, working in like vaudeville, as a performer.
Yeah, that was one of the things as I was refreshing myself with his biography that stood out right away is one, his issues with his mother and her battles with mental illness. And she was actually committed to an insane asylum like a couple of different times in his life, although she was committed at one point and was gone for a while, but then she eventually came back and he had the experience of being reunited with her, but then lost her again at some point where she was then committed again. And that seems really relevant because I remember this one story from the last one of the last Venus retrogrades of the woman, I'm spacing out her name, but who like married who murdered her mother or had her boyfriend like murder her mother that
Oh
was in the
yeah,
news.
she had her name was Gypsy something because
Yeah, Gypsy Rose
that
Blanchard. And I
that's right,
think
that's right.
I believe that was like one of our Venus retrogrades we were talking about last time. It just
Yes,
brought up how
yes.
sometimes there can be issues with the mother or something strange or different or that goes against normal societal grain, the societal expectations or other things about the mother, sometimes with the Venus retrograde as a natal signature. And hearing about his mother and some of the issues with that reminded me of that, as well as his experience of having getting her back at some point, but then losing her again. Being similar almost to the motion of Venus retrograde of this forward and then backwards motion.
Yeah, and Charlie's mother will pop up in our story. One of those returns will pop up in our story as we're exploring the Venus retrogrades. Hitler, on the other hand, I mean, his mother.
Well, hold on. Last thing
Oh
about
yes, sorry.
the mother though with Chaplin is his mother sang and he
Yeah.
like imitated and mimicked his mother, and that's how he started actually getting into performance was through his mother's singing originally.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she would sometimes, she wouldn't be able to appear, and then he'd have to, like, in order for the family to eat, he'd have to go do the job that she was supposed to do. That's kind of how these things happened. So yeah, it's not your modern showbiz story.
Yeah, and then at the same time, his father took off and like left the family so that the mother was struggling to pay bills, and that's why they were so poor. And then at one point, like he had to, when the mother was thrown in a mental asylum, he had to go back with the father, but the father was like abusive or a drunk or something like that.
Yeah, well, I forget if it was abusive or drunk or just sort of generally disinterested. But this was Victorian England. It's not like a single mother could go out and get a job at the typing pool or whatever. I mean, it was a very different social order. So that in itself is another thing. Is Venus retrograde in that kind of society can be sort of the quote unquote fallen woman, if you will. Um, talk about sort of, disrupting society or things like that. It's, not by will or design, but merely by existing. Nonetheless, it's another very sort of common Venus retrograde theme in, that kind of world.
Yeah, like a woman that finds herself having to do something different as a result of societal expectations and the fact that she's going against it or something. Because that makes me think of
Yeah,
Jack Nicholson, who was another Venus
right.
retrograde in Aries that we've talked about in our third house episode, where you pointed out to me that he grew up thinking that his mother, that his the woman that he experienced as his sister was actually.
His mother and
All right.
the woman he thought was his mother was actually his grandmother, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm tripping up on this that his mother had him when she was young and not married, and therefore the family pretended that his grandmother was actually his mother and that his mother was his sister, and he didn't find out until he was like an adult and a famous movie star when a reporter told him at one point, and
Yeah.
that's his kind of crazy Venus retrograde in Aries story.
Yeah, exactly. And both women went to their graves without telling him. He had another sister who survived, and he was able to confirm the story with her. But it's kind of wild that they both went to their graves without telling him. Yeah, it was at one point just to be a mother without a man looking after you, whether it was of your own doing or not, was, by default a sort of state of disgrace. So, that's the way it was. And in that kind of world, yeah, Venus retrograde will signify that.
And I just looked it up and to remind myself in Gypsy Rose Blanchard, we were talking about her the last Venus retrograde in 2023 because she was born 4 days before Venus turned retrograde in
Right.
Virgo and had Libra rising with Venus in the 12th house conjunct Mars. Um, so
Yeah.
that's so that's one theme I want to keep in mind as we're doing our Venus retrograde research sometimes is like the relationship with the mother and there being something different or strange or sometimes difficult about that for unique reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so tell me about this Hitler fellow.
Oh yeah, this charming guy. So his mother, is on the other hand, married and not, apparently insane, which is surprising given who her offspring winds up being. But she does. She actually she lost the child she had before Adolf. So Adolf is, this is in a period when, of course, it was more common for children to not survive. Families would have more of them because not all of them would live. But because an older sibling had died, his mother was very traumatized. And so she was sort of extra clingy and indulgent to Adolf. And she was
Mm,
considerably younger than his father, too. So there was a real disconnect. It wasn't a happy or comfortable marriage, to put it mildly. And she died very young. She died when he was 18, right when he was failing out of art school. That's the thing, is it's the double edge. Like his mother dies and he's not been accepted into art school
mm,
virtually at the same time, very close together. And he's
wow.
18 and he has no idea what to do. Even though he is going to go on to become this terrible person, at that point in his life, when he's 18 and all that's happening to him, you can't help but feel for his position at that point.
Yeah,
That's the last you'll get from me. But yeah,
right. Yeah,
he's 18. He hasn't done anything wrong yet.
you
We're
were like you can't help but feel for him becoming a Nazi, and I was like, I don't know.
well, no, 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 that's not where I'm going with that. But just when you're an 18-year-old and you haven't been accepted to the school you want, and your mother's died, and you don't know what to do with your life, that I think anyone
Decided
would sympathize. Yeah.
take
No,
over
no, of
Europe,
course
that's a
not.
natural,
Yeah. Oh
very
yeah.
natural, very
No, no, that's not where I'm
perfect,
going with this. That's not where I'm
perfectly
going with that.
normal,
Yeah.
perfectly healthy.
Yeah.
All right. So he had a very difficult relationship with his father, and his father was abusive, right? Hitler?
Oh yeah. 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 Schicklgruber, Alois Hitler. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Yeah, he was just he wasn't a good father. He was an old guy, and I don't think he was interested in anything other than children sort of doing what they were told and not speaking very much.
Okay. Um, so in terms of Venus retrogrades, do we have one that was like the first one, or where do we come in terms of Venus retrogrades being important for them?
Okay, well, I mean the big one. Well, we can cut to the chase. I don't have that great detail on their very young years in terms of a timeline. I have some of the dates that Chaplin was working in vaudeville theater. He did tours of America and Britain for years, quite a few. Um, Hitler, we sort of know where he was living and what he was doing. He moved to Vienna. He was from this smaller town in Austria, but he moved to Vienna, and he lived in a sort of like men's workhouse for a while, or men's rooming house, I should say. And he was known as this crank who painted and ranted against the Jews. So he was already at that, even before the First World War. And then he ran out of money, and he was like virtually homeless. And so he moved from Vienna to Munich. He moved to Germany from Austria. And he is 24 years old when he does this in May of 1913.
Okay,
And it's,
so this
yeah,
is May of 1913.
yeah,
He's how old? 16?
24.
Oh,
He's just
24.
turned 24.
So this is three Venus retrograde like repetitions.
Yeah.
So Hitler was Hitler was born under Venus retrograde in Taurus, and then going back, it would eventually go back into Aries in the next cycle. And
That's right.
then every 8 years that repeats. So at 8 years old, at 16 years old, and then finally at 24 years old. So we're in a year 1913 when Venus goes retrograde in Aries, um, sort of like when he was born, connecting it back, and he has a major important relocation where he moves from Austria to Germany.
Yeah. And, foreshadowing being what it is, I mean, this is the future Führer of Germany moving to Germany for the first time. So it does, given that we have the privilege of seeing the foreshadowing at work, it's remarkable. It on the one hand, it's just like a young, guy in his 20s moving to a new city in a new country because he doesn't, feel like he belongs in his own or that he's doing very well. Something that happens to millions of people. But it's obviously it's special because it's him and because of what he's going to become. Um,
Right.
so
I'm trying
yes,
to
in
think
May
of
of
like a parallel of that, of like somebody moving from one country to another who then eventually rises up to become the
oh,
leader of that country
I know,
is
I know too. I
okay.
know of this. I know of a Corsican kid who went to start going to school in France and eventually becomes the emperor of France. And then I
Right.
also know of this, like,
So Napoleon.
that's right, Napoleon. I also know about this thug from Georgia who, does things like robs banks, but gives all the money to this revolutionary guy he's never met named Lenin, and then becomes his sort of, second in command, if you will, once the Russian Revolution takes over. And when Lenin dies, he becomes the, de facto leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
there is a pattern. There is, yeah, the Corsican who rules France or the Georgian who rules Russia or the Austrian who rules Germany. There is, something to that.
Right.
Um,
So there's definitely instances of this in the past of somebody that moves from a different country or a different region and then rises up through the ranks to become the leader of that entire country. And this is Hitler doing that in 1913 during a Venus retrograde in Aries year.
that's right. Yeah, in May of 1913, Venus was going retrograde from Taurus to Aries, just as it had been 24 years earlier when he was born. So yeah, that's happening. But the amazing thing to me is during that same month, in May of 1913, within about 2 weeks of each other, Charlie Chaplin is doing a vaudeville theater tour of the United States, and he's in Philadelphia, and he gets a telegram inviting him to Hollywood to participate in this new art form that's developing out there, this moving pictures thing that is starting to catch on. So he is invited to Hollywood at first to sort of act in this director Max Sennett, who was an early pioneer of silent comedy movies. So first he goes to be in Max Sennett's movies, but within a year or two, like, in a very short time, Chaplin realizes he could be a better director and winds up and he becomes a huge success and a film director, and really quite an innovative one as well.
Right. So this is he's in New York when he gets the invite, right?
Philadelphia, I think.
It's like
Philadelphia.
he's acting in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's doing like acting on the East Coast. How long has he even been in the US for at this point?
He's done several tours. I think this is like his third tour. His first tour of the US was in 1910. So this was something he was doing as part of work. It wasn't uncommon.
Okay.
Vaudeville had a tradition in England and America. So it was the kind of thing where you did get these, touring companies coming over and traveling from city to city and doing their shows. Cinema was only just becoming a thing. So this really was the main entertainment of the day.
Got it. Okay. So this is like acting on the East Coast, and then he gets scouted and he gets this invitation to come to Hollywood, and then he would become this pivotal figure in Hollywood of not just the highest paid actor, but also somebody that changes and sets new norms in Hollywood, including starting major studio. I mean, it's basically the Hitler's equivalent of like
Yeah,
basically his destiny was to rise into this leadership role of Germany, and he moves to Germany at that time. Chaplin's destiny was to rise into prominence in Hollywood, and he moves to Hollywood under the same Venus retrograde. That's crazy.
yeah, exactly. That's kind of the way this whole, you know, the narrative is going to unfold, is just the two of them are experiencing largely, for the most part, very similar things at the same time. Certainly, I mean, this is a very strong example of that because yes, um, I mean, Charlie Chaplin is as important to cinema as Hitler is to, 20th century geopolitics. I mean, it just, virtually defines it, virtually, uh, um, yeah, just the face of the little tramp is as iconic as anything that we get from the Second World War. So it is a big deal for Chaplin to be going to Hollywood or to be invited to Hollywood and go there, and for Hitler to be going to Munich, going to Germany, moving there for the first time at that same month when it's a Venus retrograde return of their natal Venus retrogrades. Yeah, it is amazing.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. So, quick digression about Venus retrograde periods. The Venus retrograde lasts for 40 days once Venus stations retrograde before it stations direct. But there's also a broader period where you can extend that based on the shadow periods, like the pre-retrograde shadow period and the post-retrograde shadow period. And that's one I like to focus on a lot. Um, there's also one of the ways that I conceptualize it is that the Venus retrograde is also experienced as if it's like a long transit of Venus through one sign or sometimes two signs if the retrograde crosses a sign boundary, which extends it because then you're having like an extended Venus transit in a certain part of your chart. And like, for example, this year, because Venus goes retrograde in Aries and it goes back to Pisces, that means that the entire period of Venus transiting those two signs will actually last for about 6 months from Venus going into Pisces on January 2nd, all the way until Venus departing from Aries for the last time on June 5th. So that's like a huge chunk of time, sort of with the retrograde as like the nucleus, the most important point in the middle, the actual retrograde, but there are surrounding periods of importance around it. And you've also identified another important one, which is the period of maximum elongation, right?
Yeah. Well, what I found, because again, the cycle of Venus is so symmetrical. So I found that if you take the whole 8-year Venus cycle and divide it into parts, you can get this very even part if you go from the maximum elongation to from one maximum elongation of Venus to the other, where there's a retrograde in between. The first greatest elongation, which is actually Eastern, um, no, sorry, Western. It's kind of counterintuitive in terms of what the greatest elongation is, but it proceeds 50 days before the station. Then you get the 40-day retrograde, and then 50 days after the direct station, you have the other greatest elongation. So these are the two periods when Venus is at the greatest distance from the sun. And therefore it's close to its brightest glow, and that's another element I think to this period. The Venus retrograde, indeed, it is going back and forth through degrees, but it's also radically changing in speed and in visibility. Sort of back and forth. It's slowing down, it stops, it accelerates retrograde, and then it stops again. And at the same time, it's coming in and out of visibility. It's disappearing from the western sky. It's rising in the eastern sky. So over the course of a fairly short period of time, it's transforming again and again over the course of that fairly brief period. So yeah, I do look at about a 146-day period where that goes from greatest elongation to greatest elongation with the retrogrades in between. And if I do that, you're literally cutting out just like a perfectly even 5% of the total Venus cycle. In other words, like even this phenomenon is proportional and symmetrical and very easy to measure. Um, so
Right.
I mean, that's the beauty of the cycle. It almost like allows you, not unlike the way the solstices and the equinoxes give us this very natural, even way to divide the ecliptic, up against something. The Venus cycle has its own way of just being divided very evenly, and you can study its cycle in these different parts that are basically all the same size, 20 equal parts.
Yeah, I was noticing that the other night, when I went for a walk at night, and I looked up in the sky, and Venus was super, super bright, and it was conjoining the moon and Saturn, um, because that's, they're all
Yeah,
clustered in Pisces the other night. And once Venus moved into tropical Pisces, it's applying to conjunction with Saturn in Pisces as well. And Venus is just like super, super bright because it's getting ready to go retrograde, and therefore when it stations retrograde, it's getting as far away from the sun as it can, so therefore its brightness gets increased.
exactly. So yeah, if you think of that very special 146-day period, you're thinking of Venus being very from at its furthest distance from the sun on one side, then approaching the sun, but then I mean, sort of past the sun, reaching its greatest point, going retrograde, coming back to the sun in the retrograde, making the interior conjunction. Then it continues and finally stations direct, but the sun keeps going. And so Venus winds up being again at its greatest elongation from the sun on the other side. And all of this in a very short period of time. So in 146 days, there are the two greatest elongations that it makes from the sun on either side of the sun, and the retrograde, and the different levels of brightness and visibility and invisibility, and setting in the left, setting in the west, rising in the east. All that happens in this fairly short period of time. Whereas the rest of the time, Venus is fairly static. I mean, there is the exterior conjunction with the sun as well, but apart from that, it's generally visible and generally consistent in its speed. So it is this really sort of special period where Venus goes through all these transformations very quickly.
Yeah, so you have a whole separate video about your system for dividing the Venus cycles and classifying them based on the different retrogrades. It's on your YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, I have a video called Introduction to the Venus Synodic Cycle, and explains how I break down the Venus cycle into these parts, into this system that you can study independently of each other, that each have their own sort of character, apparently. And yeah, it's a very interesting way of first of all, that helps you sort of work with the Venus cycle and follow it over long periods of time. Um, and yeah, it also just sort of helps you follow things like transits of this nature, nativities like we're studying today, where the life really seems to be almost timed by the recurring returns, 8-year returns of Venus.
Right. Okay. So people can check that video out for more information about that. But okay, so to bring it back to our current topic, because I just wanted to mention that in terms of,
Yeah.
that we're focused on the Venus retrograde, the 40 days as the nucleus of our time period, but there's also a broader spectrum that extends outside of that. So people can look at that episode, or I've done other Venus retrograde episodes. I did a major one with you and Patrick in the past where we talked about some of this as well.
Hmm.
So let's get back to our narrative. So Hitler moves to Germany under this retrograde in 1913, and Chaplin moves to Hollywood. So then, yeah. So what's next after this in our story?
Well, that's the beauty. We're going to jump ahead 8 years. And so, like when we left the two of them in 1913, one of them is a homeless guy who's just moved to a foreign country. And the other guy is like this, theater rat who's gotten this dubious invitation to go across the continent and work in this new industry that doesn't have the greatest reputation at the time. It's thought to be a kind of uh, disrespectful, or not a respectful profession, shall we say. Um, but in those intervening 8 years, Chaplin's going to become a huge movie star quite quickly. And so much so that by the time Venus goes retrograde in 1921, the next time it goes retrograde in Taurus to Aries in 1921, He's already worked for a number of different film studios. He started United Artists in 1919. He's been married and divorced already once, and he's getting ready to get married again, which is going to go even poorly. More, it's going to be even worse for him. And yeah, a lot has changed just in those 8 years. Hitler, in the meantime, of course, after he moved to Munich in 1913, he evaded the Austrian draft because he didn't want to fight for the Austrian army, but he very enthusiastically signed up for the German army. In fact, there's even a famous photo of Munich in like August 1st, 1914, when war between Britain and Germany was declared. And Hitler's face has been identified as one of the faces in the crowd who are just thrilled that Germany's going to be, fighting a war. Um, yeah, I mean, Hitler just had some funny ideas about nationhood and race, as we probably know. And so he had ideas about the German nation being the real nation of the German race, or whereas Austria was this empire of different nationalities, and he saw that as some kind of travesty. This is Venus retrograde stuff. Like this isn't the way things should be. I think things should be that way. Um, just that sort of attitude. So he winds up fighting with the German army in the First World War, and he is decorated. He's a runner. He's a messenger. So he does a lot of stuff that's that puts his life on the line, and so he's decorated for bravery. Um, and he's when the war ends in 1918 for Germany, he's recovering. He's been blinded temporarily in a gas attack, and he's in a hospital with bandages on his eyes. And he finds out that Germany has surrendered, or has signed an armistice, rather, has not surrendered, but signed an armistice. And he's devastated. And really distraught. But the thing is, he eventually, recovers his eyesight. And even though he was this, when he got to Germany before the war, he was this homeless Austrian dude who, didn't have a job and was kind of nuts. But because he's now a decorated war hero, he's taken seriously by Munich society, right? I mean, this is, the whole attitude changes. He's got medals on his chest. So he's being invited into, different circles. And he's recruited as a spy. There was an attempted communist revolution in Germany in 1919 as the war was ending, a sort of, extension of the Bolshevik revolution. And so Hitler is assigned to spy on this political, radical group and attend their meetings and report on them. This happens in 1919 in the summer during a Venus retrograde, but within a year and a half, by the next time Venus goes retrograde in Taurus to Aries in 1921, he's now a member of this group, no longer spying on them, but basically just about to take over leadership. It's in this period in 1921 that he gives speeches to large groups. He's been giving speeches in little, basement meeting halls or what have you. But starting in the spring of 1921, he's really starting to get acclaim as a public speaker for this, National Socialist Party that he's joined, and by the time that the retrograde is just ending in 1921, he basically takes over leadership of it, and it's I believe during this retrograde that people start calling him Führer, as
Mm.
I've read. So even though he's not going to be the leader of Germany for more than 10 years away, in fact, at this point he's a full Jupiter cycle away from being the Führer of Germany, but they are starting to call him that just in the party.
Got it. So this is the next um, Venus retrograde. It's in 1921 in like
That's
the
right.
spring and like the first and early second quarter of 1921. And he starts giving these big public speeches and basically rises into a leadership role of the Nazi Party, which that's like the great irony is that Hitler was sent as a spy to spy for the current government of Germany on the Nazi Party because they were suspicious about it, but then he ended up like joining it and then very quickly becoming the leader.
Yeah, yeah, and discovering that he had a talent for public speaking, um, you know, which is an interesting thing when you think about like Chaplin is famous for being a mime, right? He silent movies, not speaking. Whereas Hitler, really could only do one thing well, which was give speeches. So it's kind of there's an ironic twist there as well, I think.
Well, there's an element of like theatrics to both of them because it makes me think of
Yeah.
like, the hand movements that Hitler would do, but also like those famous like pictures, those like behind the scenes pictures of that photo shoot he did where he was like trying on different like poses and things like that.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, not to mention, if you've seen those movies of the Nuremberg rallies, I mean, they are like the early rock concerts. I mean, these lighting and staging that was just unprecedented. The idea of having these big searchlights and I mean, it's very dramatic, those rallies, so yeah, early use of the PA system. I mean, using this very new technology to amplify the voice, not in 1921, but as he develops his speaking career, the rallies have this sort of you're right, very theatrical, very cinematic. The film director Lenny Riefenstahl sort of directed this parade, this show, so that it would show up well in cinema. So all these, dramatic lighting and what have you was meant for the film cameras, but it also just becomes a very, yeah, theatrical experience in and of itself, albeit, a rather one with a rather nasty tone.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know, two people that are very aware of Chaplin and Hitler, the impact of film as a artistic, emotive artistic expression, but the power of that to capture sort of like hearts and minds to some extent, um,
Yeah.
and, and who both used it to great end. So I meant to show this list of dates I put together for Venus retrograde in Aries over the past century. Um, and we're not going to hit all of these today, but just to show you where we're at 1921. And this is when Hitler starts giving these big speeches, and moves into this leadership role with the Nazi Party. And that's 8 years after the previous Venus retrograde in Aries, when he literally just like moved to Germany during that time. So that's
Yeah.
already just within his individual biography, like a stunning connection and repetition. And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize with this episode that people should pay attention to in terms of Venus retrogrades in general, but also in terms of this upcoming retrograde, that sometimes Venus retrogrades can connect two successive sets of events in 8 year periods in your life, that there may be a connection or a repetition or an echo of something that happened 8 years earlier when Venus again goes retrograde in the same spot in your chart. And that's especially the case if you were born under or near that actual retrograde that's about to happen, because then it sets it up as a signature in your chart. But just in general, it's always a good idea to look at those 8 year repetitions regardless.
Yeah, it's true. If someone's born close to that particular retrograde, that's one of the things you'll follow. That's what we're doing with Chaplin and Hitler. But I mean, even if you have an Aries ascendant or an Aries midheaven, in the early degrees, that means every 8 years over the course of your life, Venus has always been making a retrograde transit over that part of your chart. And if you're paying attention, it will speak to you. It will tell you something about that you understand about your life, but only you understand about your life. But that timing interval will really teach you something about your astrology that I think no astrologer can actually duplicate for you. It's understanding your life and your chart at a very different level.
Right, for sure. All right, so that's Hitler. What is going on with Chaplin in 1921?
Well, we mentioned Chaplin's mother. It's in the spring of 1921 when Venus goes retrograde that Charlie and his brother Sidney finally managed to bring their mother to America from England, where she's been in an asylum all that time, the whole time that he's been working his way up in show business. Yeah, their mother has been, in some care facility, and they now have enough money where they can buy her a nice house, and she can just sort of, live her last years out comfortably. But because she is struggling with mental illness and Charlie's a very public figure, again, that Venus retrograde, this is, uh, today I think we understand mental illness is not something that should be a topic of shame or what have you. But in those days, again, it's just sort of an automatic disgrace of some kind, or it's perceived as such. Um, so Chaplin is very, on the one hand, he wants to do right by his mother. On the other hand, he's kind of embarrassed and doesn't really want to spend time with her. And it's ironic that within a few months of her getting to America and them setting her up in a house, he goes to England for the first time for like a big English tour. It's almost like he can't get far away enough from her. So it is a complicated relationship. He
Mm.
loves her enough to get her a nice house, but he's also kind of like, yeah, I mean, he hasn't known her most of his life too, I suppose, is the thing. Um,
So, but he's at the point in his career where he's well off enough that he can finance stuff like this because in the intervening years, 8 years between 1913 when he moved to Hollywood, 1921, he became like the highest paid actor in Hollywood. He became mega successful, maybe the most visible actor at that time during the course of that decade. So very rich and famous. He starts a movie studio. At one point, I heard he was getting paid like $10,000 a week or something like that.
right.
Um,
In 1919 dollars with, so
right,
that's a lot of money.
which is
Um,
crazy. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
So
that's just
he's
it. I mean, he's huge. Yeah.
he's huge at this point. Is there anything else in the 1921 one that's relevant to know?
Well, I mean, he did. He was burned on a movie set, which was made the papers and it may or may not have had something to do with Venus retrograde. I don't know of any other instance of him being injured on the set. It's just something I noticed happened around then.
Hmm.
Um, no, but aside from that, I think the big thing was just yeah, settling with his mother and then running off to England, going back to England for the first time since he's been in America, making his fame and fortune. So yeah, it's an interesting move on his part to do that.
In the notes, you say that his mother was detained on arrival in the U.S.
Yeah, well, because I mean, until Charlie and Sydney could go and say, "Oh no, she's our mother. She's coming with us." Um, I can just imagine what a British woman who spent maybe the past 2 decades or so in some institution, and then sails across to America. They're going to have some questions.
Hmm.
But it eventually, yeah, it went through. But this is the kind of thing. I mean, I think the reason she was detained is, it was clear that she wasn't, in the best mental health, and so
Hmm.
that raises eyebrows. And this is the kind of thing Charlie's embarrassed about.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's 1921. So then we jump forward 8 years to 1929.
Yeah. 1929 is kind of thin in this example. Um, it would have been perfect if Chaplin had met, not to Chaplin, if Hitler had met what's it, Ava Braun during the Venus retrograde, but he didn't. He didn't meet her until October. But he started working with the
October of
photographer
later that
of
same year.
of later that same year. But he did
Huh.
start working with. He met her. She was the assistant to a photographer that he worked with, and he did start working with that photographer in April. Um, but yeah, I don't know that much about the 1921 retrograde for Hitler, other than like he's rebuilding the Nazi Party. I think they do win some significant regional elections during that time. And for Chaplin, he's at the very first Academy Awards, um, which is that's something that we'll probably cover in a in the broader episode, because there are some very interesting Venus retrograde stories with the Academy Awards. But in this instance, it's best to go to 1937. I just don't have much for 1929 for other than the Academy
No, I
Awards.
mean I don't want to skip that. That's really important. The
Oh,
Academy
okay.
the very first Academy Awards
The
occurred
very
in
first Academy Awards.
1929,
Yeah, yeah.
and he's Charlie
He's
Chaplin.
He's Charlie Chaplin. He's there. Um, at this point, they're not the big deal that they're going to become. The idea is for, Louis Mayer to throw a little party and people give speeches and they, all decide what's the best movie of the year. It's gonna grow over the years. And in fact, it'll be 8 years later, the ceremony in 1937, which I guess is the ninth Academy Awards, is the first one where they have like the categories are set and named, and there's five contenders for every, and then a winner out of those five. So it becomes the Academy Awards that we know, like the context, the structure, 8 years after this one at the next Venus retrograde, 1937. But this is the very first one. And yeah, this is the initiation chart for the Academy Awards, this date in 1929. And there certainly is, it's an affair that is associated with glamour and sort of the very best of show business, ostensibly. So that there is something interesting to that. And of course,
Yeah.
it's ostensibly an appreciation of the arts. You see in the original Oscar chart that Venus coming out of the retro, or it's just station direct. It's station direct 5 days earlier. So it's a very slow moving, solid Venus in the fifth house in that chart. And it's a love of the arts, but it is Venus in Aries. Film is not a respectable art form just yet. So there is an element of that. Um, uh, that it's something kind of I don't know, lowbrow, or I mean, this was a time when people really thought about respectability in a whole other way, and these are the politics of Venus. Venus is very much that the planet of social respectability, or the whatever the opposite of that is. So I think you get an element of all those things in this chart.
Right. And I mean, Charlotte, one of the things that's interesting about this, because he attends the first Academy Awards in person, and then many years later, and we'll get to this,
Yeah,
but that he would eventually receive an honorary Academy Award.
yeah, that's a really heart wrenching moment. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, because you got to understand the context for it to really hit.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So really quickly, I did a search really quickly. I used Google Gemini, Google's AI, just to run a quick search because it's 2025 and that's what you do. And it said for Hitler in 1929, it said that the Nazi Party performed poorly in the 1928 elections, but that the onset of the Great Depression in 1929 played into Hitler's hands, and he seized the opportunity to capitalize on economic hardship and social unrest, blaming the government and using anti-Semitic rhetoric to gain support, so that it says that he ramped up his public appearances and propaganda efforts in the first half of 1929, and his fiery speeches and charismatic personality attracted a growing following. The Nazi Party began to gain momentum and attracted more members and more resources. So this is partially like a repetition of his like 1921 stuff where he first starts giving these big speeches and really moving into this leadership role and attracting so many people that he's sort of like, I don't know a better word for like
Yeah,
hypnotizing or whatever with these speeches and this rhetoric, and now he's like ratcheting it up to another level in 1929.
yeah. I mean, I was aware of the sort of the general circumstances of where he is. I just didn't have like a specific, event like this happened. That it's not like moving to Munich or giving his first big speeches or things like that. But yeah, that
Right.
mind you, the stock market doesn't crash until, late October of 1929. So in the spring of 1929, the economy hasn't crashed just yet. He might still be ramping up those appearances because I know they did do poorly in 1928, and they're going to do quite well in 1930. So that is an important turning point, certainly. Um, but yeah, I just didn't know of like, one specific thing that he was doing in the spring of 1929. But he is
Yeah,
on his
well
way up at
that's
that point. Yeah.
and that's going to be one of our issues because we're focusing on singular events here, but realistically, when you live through a Venus retrograde, you realize that it's usually a sequence of events that are playing
Yeah.
out over a month or a month and a half of the actual retrograde, or sometimes a longer period of like a few months when you include the shadow periods and the time it takes to transit through both the sign that it's retrograding in or however long it stays there, that it's usually like a sequence of several events that are like playing out over the course of this period of time. So that's one of the things that are a little tricky.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And then with Chaplin, it just says that he was struggling because talking films were becoming really
Yeah.
prominent at that point, and as a silent film star by 1929, he was really struggling with it.
Yeah, he would still make two more silent films, to his two best, City Limits and Modern Times. Um, Modern Times makes brilliant use of sound while he's still playing the silent tramp character, who only at the very end of the movie does sing a song, but he sings it in a gibberish language. So, like you hear his voice, but he doesn't actually say any words that mean anything in any language. So it's kind of a brilliant finish to the film. But he makes amazing use of sound in creating that film. Again, he's such an innovator. The design is really, for the era, really advanced. And there's a great little sort of story of how he came to make Modern Times. He made another trip to London in 1933, and Gandhi was in town at that time. And Gandhi had never seen a movie in his life, but he had heard about this man who made these, movies, who made the whole world laugh. And so Gandhi wanted to meet him, and Chaplin was like, yeah, I'll go meet him. So he goes to see Gandhi, where Gandhi is staying in London, and Gandhi is, sitting in this room on the floor, and he's spinning his spinning cloth wheel. And Chaplin says, "Why are you spinning that spinning cloth wheel?" And Gandhi says, "Well, the British Empire has ruined India's economy, and so I'm doing this to encourage Indians to make their own clothing so that they're not being exploited by the British Empire." And the whole idea of, like he says, technology is ruining, is more specifically. And so Chaplin starts thinking about technology and how technology is ruining his livelihood right now. And so he
Hmm.
makes Modern Times as a sort of political movie, in part inspired by his encounter with Gandhi. Um, so I think that's sort of like and that is his last great silent film. The next film he'll make is The Great Dictator at the end of the decade, which is, of course, lampooning Hitler himself.
Right. Okay. So, anyway, so he was, yeah, attending Academy Awards, the rise of this new medium that's challenging the supremacy of that he's established of his own like dominance of the medium up to that point. Um, yeah, so the film's just moving into a new era then. So it's not just, it's like talking films are coming in and that's starting to usher in a new era by the late 1920s, but also if the first Academy Award like ceremony is taking place in 1929, that's also ushering in a new era of film.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The industry is about to change. So even though he's about to make two of his best movies, he's making them, he knows as the sun is setting on what he can do with the tramp character. The time's running. If anything, I mean, he and Greta Garbo are the two silent film stars who managed to just like extend their silent careers a little longer because they're popular enough that they can do that. But eventually, that they do have to cave in and adapt. And she adapts quite well for a few years at least. And he manages to keep doing what he does, but it's the tramp character really was his main deal until it just became um, yeah, an anachronism of the industry.
Got it. All right. So let's jump forward 8 years to the next one, which is a Venus retrograde in Aries in 1937.
Yeah, yeah. As we get to 1937, the retrogrades really are wandering further into Aries by now. I think spending probably a bit more time in Aries than Taurus by this point, because they always gradually recede with every 8-year return. So in 1937, for Hitler, the Venus retrograde is the bombing of Guernica, which is basically the first use of what is going to be called blitzkrieg. That was a term the British came up with later, but the manner in which German planes sort of carpet bomb a given region was a new development in warfare. So the Spanish Civil War was happening between a sort of a very communist Republican faction and then a more monarchist conservative militaristic faction. And Stalin was to some degree helping the communist faction, although not as much as he could have, which is what inspired Orwell to write Animal Farm. But Hitler assisted Franco, the Spanish fascist leader, and sent planes to bomb Guernica, which is in the north of Spain. It's part of the Basque country, which has always been resistant enough anyway to centralized Spanish authority. And yeah, it's a real travesty. It inspired the great painting by Picasso, but it was the first instance. Hitler had been, he'd invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia and all that, but this was a very different thing to just sort of fly planes in and bomb people without, yeah. I mean, even Austria, all he did was he went in there with tanks, which wasn't nearly as violent. So it was a foreshadowing of the kind of thing that Hitler would be doing as the Second World War erupted.
That's really striking that Picasso, because Picasso started painting Guernica in May of 1937, and
Hmm.
so it's striking that he started painting that, which became one of his most paintings, which was based on this war crime or this atrocity that occurred under that Venus retrograde in Aries. So there was a provocative like piece of art basically that came out of
Yeah,
this period.
that's exactly right. That's a great example of Venus retrograde in the art. Very because Venus retrograde is sort of provocative and it can be sensational, but certainly it's meant to sort of break some rules. This is what Venus retrograde is all about: is like sort of changing things, which in society can often be an uncomfortable process, but in the arts, it's kind of what you want. You want your great art to do that much of the time. There was also Jean Renoir made this film, the Grand Delusion, which was an anti-war film, and that came out around this time in 1937. Also very critical of Hitler. When Hitler invaded the France, the first thing he wanted to do was destroy every copy of the Grand Delusion. Renoir was the son of the great painter Pierre-Auguste Renoir, the Impressionist, and he was an incredible filmmaker. So there were these you had Guernica, you had the Grand Illusion, you had these works of art that were provocative, that were making statements that certainly Nazis didn't like, and other authoritarians didn't like. And that is very Venus retrograde indeed. There's a great story about once the Nazis did go into Paris, and of course Picasso lived in Paris. They went into his studio. This is probably just apocryphal, but it's a great story. The Nazis go into Picasso's studio and they look at Guernica and they say, "Did you do this?" And he goes, "No, you did this." Great little moment there. But yeah,
Nice.
that's that is Venus retrograde in the arts. It is meant to do that. That's its function.
I aspire to have a quip like that someday. One of these days, we'll
Yeah,
see. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Bring it on.
so 1937, Hitler's consolidating power, purging the Nazi Party from any remaining opposition. Germany's making economic progress, but he's also like preparing for war behind the scenes.
That's basically it. Yeah, that's the long and short of it. Of course, Hitler bombs Guernica thinking Franco's going to be his ally, but Franco's going to bow out. He's had it. He's gotten what he needed by the time the Second World War proper breaks out.
Okay.
Although,
So,
yeah, I was just going to say, in many ways, the Spanish Civil War, you can see it as being part of the Second World War, but it's also obviously separate in its own way.
right. So what happened with Chaplin during this time?
Chaplin at this time, so he's done with the tramp. I don't think he's come up with the Great Dictator just yet, or maybe he's starting to think about it. But it's in 1937 that he sells his interest in United Artists. It was a company he founded with two other movie stars, his friends, Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. And the three of them decide, they've had it with film studios. I guess they all sort of see themselves at this point as being kind of has-beens anyway, so might as well cash in. They're not big movie stars anymore. They're from another era. So they sell off this studio. They had founded United Artists during the Venus retrograde or close to it in 1919 in the summer, the one that happened in Virgo to Leo in those days, or just in Virgo in those days. And here they were selling it during the Venus retrograde in Aries. So it's interesting. Yeah, Hitler's consolidating power. Chaplin is sort of, um, in a chrysalis stage, I suppose. He knows his past is behind him, and he's still, sort of the future is not quite clear yet. But eventually, he knows what he wants to do, and that is to play Hitler in a movie. To do a Hitler satire.
Right. Yeah, apparently he was like working on that in he's already developing that film targeting Hitler, which would be his first true sound and major
Yeah.
departure from his usual like comedic style.
Yeah, I mean there is comedy in it. Yeah, like I said, modern times has sound in the film. It has synchronized sound in the film. It just he doesn't give any like dialogue other than singing a gibberish song at the end. In The Great Dictator, rather, he's playing a Hitler like character, and he has lines of dialogue. Like he's an actor. He's a speaking actor in film, as one is.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but the big thing for Chaplin was just selling his shares in United Artists at that point. So he cashed out basically.
Yeah, yeah, he's cashed out, and he is working on the Hitler film, but who knows how that's going to turn out. So,
So he must have become like wildly rich from selling United Artists, right?
oh yeah, yeah, and he's enjoying a good life. He's sailing with his friends and playing tennis and enjoying the life of a wealthy former star. He does have strong left-wing leanings, and by this point, he's under regular supervision of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover takes a strong dislike to Chaplin back in the 20s. So even though he's a multimillionaire, he's quite the lefty, and he gives money to left-wing causes, and he hosts dinner parties to raise money for these kinds of causes. Um, yeah, he's becoming kind of a political radical and putting himself in the crosshairs of the sort of the anti-communist movement in the United States. And it doesn't help that even though he's been living in the United States all this time, that he's never become an American citizen. As opposed to Hitler, who became not just a German citizen but the leader of the country.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
these things will come back. We'll be getting back to this soon. This
Yeah.
theme.
Just looking, it says that even though the movie Chaplin's movie Modern Times was released in 36, he spent the first half of 1937 dealing with the continued fallout as well as the success of the movie, where it was a satire on industrialization and social inequality, but that yeah, some quarters
Yeah.
saw it as having communist sympathies, and so he starts. This is like during that period of like the Red Scare and increasing paranoia about communism in the United States. So he starts becoming like under the focus of that partially at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was already in their sights before he made Modern Times. But yeah, if you've seen Modern Times, it certainly is. It casts a skeptical eye on the Industrial Revolution and technology and worker exploitation is a big theme in it. So yeah, someone watching in the 1930s could very easily think that he's a raging communist because of that movie.
Got it. Okay. All right, so then we move forward and we jump in 8 year increments to our next period, which is 1945. So
Yeah,
is 8 years from 1937. I don't think that much happened in 1935, so we can probably skip this period.
1945. Yeah, no, it was they both just sort of I think they were both on vacation that whole time. No,
Right.
yeah, yeah. No, seriously though. I mean, we know it's the worst time in Hitler's life. It's also the end of it. But it's also the worst time in Chaplin's life. Chaplin isn't
Hmm.
having quite the bad time Hitler is, but he's having a very, very bad time in the worst time of his life.
Let's start with Hitler
Let's
because
start with
his,
Hitler. Yeah.
life story wraps up at this point and it's
Yes.
slightly more consequential than Chaplin's was to world
True.
events. So, in
Yeah.
researching this
And
Venus retrograde,
I was going to say there's also a very funny meme, a little video of Hitler that you can see that takes place during this period we're talking about. So yeah, sorry,
okay,
please continue.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I keep coming back to in researching this Venus retrograde that's coming up in 2025 in the first part of the year is that the most like consequential time that this Venus retrograde happened in the past century was in 1945 as the war in Europe is drawing to a close and both the Russians are like invading Germany from the eastern
E-
side of the map, and then the Americans and the British and everyone else is like invading from the western side of the map, and they're all closing in on Germany, and then Hitler ends up committing suicide in his bunker, and within days, the war in Europe with Germany is finally over.
Yeah, I believe the armistice is signed as Venus is stationing direct. Um, and Hitler had his 56th birthday 10 days before he ended his life. 56 is a multiple of 8. It is a year where you get the Venus synodic return in the chart, and hence Hitler was born during a Venus retrograde, and he ended his life during the Venus retrograde as the war was collapsing around him.
That's
The
incredible.
Yeah, the age of 56 is a joint Venus and nodal return. So it's a Venus synodic return, but also the nodes make a return. I happen to be 56 as we're speaking right now. So it's a striking year for that reason. And it does sort
Which
of
which means that the eclipses recur in that year in
exactly,
56 because that's what we experienced last year that was causing all those weird or
right.
coinciding with all those weird repetitions in the political race in the United States last year in 2024 where there were a bunch of connections like weird repetitions with
Yeah.
1968, and it turned out that was because of this 56-year repetition of both Venus and the nodes and the eclipses.
Yeah, in on our New Year's Eve show of 2023, Patrick and I talked about how 2024 looked a lot like 1968. Next thing you know, Columbia University is being occupied by students. Kennedy is running in the election. The president, the standing president, isn't going to be running in the next election. All these, an attempted assassination. All these 1968-ish type things. The Democrats are having their convention in Chicago.
Right.
Yeah, there
And
were
there's
just
and
all
there's
these.
and there's major protests there, and then it's like
Yes, yeah.
and
There was a
then
lot of that. Yeah.
yeah.
So there you
So
go.
56, so Hitler basically killed himself shortly after he turned 56, and he was having
Right.
this not just Venus repetition, but also nodal and eclipse repetition from his birth chart.
That's right. And he dies the same month that Mussolini is also killed, but also Franklin Roosevelt had died. And we're not going to get it into today, but I'm just going to mention that we can take FDR's life and trace his life with these Venus retrogrades in Aries, and it's also very, very powerful. He
Mm,
first gets married. He gets married in 1905 during the Venus retrograde. He gets his first government job in 1913 during the Venus retrograde. One thing after the other. So his life as well really went according to that rhythm. But we'll put that aside for now. The other thing, I guess, since we're talking about Hitler, is just to mention that 8 years after Hitler dies, Stalin will also die during the Venus retrograde in Aries. So, like so many of those World War II leaders are going to die during Venus retrogrades. When Charles de Gaulle eventually dies, it'll be when Venus is retrograde in Scorpio. The only one of them who doesn't die during a Venus retrograde is Winston Churchill, who was born during one. So,
mm.
during the one in Sagittarius. So, yeah, there's a lot of Venus retrograde in the Second World War that's very interesting. But certainly Hitler being born during this and dying during the same retrograde transit is really striking. And that was one of the things that sort of drew me into studying this cycle in its own right, was just being so aware of Chaplin and Hitler as a pair and how their lives unfolded in this way.
Yeah, I mean, especially for Hitler, that just becomes incredibly striking that it's like he's born into the Venus retrograde cycle in that sign. He moves to Germany under the same retrograde in 1913. He rises to power and starts giving some of his biggest speeches in 1920, not 21 during that retrograde. And then
Hmm.
eventually, like, he ends his life and loses the war by 1945 and, like, closes out his story under the same retrograde. And those other two are also important, the intervening two, but just that the bookend there is pretty wild.
Yeah, yeah, agreed, agreed. That's really something.
So some people just really respond strongly to Venus retrograde cycles, and Hitler was one of them. And it's also striking that World War II came to an end under a Venus retrograde, and that's a striking thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. Civil War, 80 years earlier, also ended during that same Venus retrograde,
Mm.
and also with the death of a president, and also Abe Lincoln had only just turned 56 when that happened. Not to compare him to Hitler, but 56 does come up a lot in these sort of circumstances. Washington was president at the age of 56. Nixon and LBJ became president at 56. That Venus nodal return has a real deep meaning, I think, in a person's personal narrative. You either sort of arrive, or in Hitler's case, you fall. But it's a real sort of moment of truth, it seems.
Yeah. And Venus retrograde. Yeah, yeah. Okay. There's something else I was going to say, but I can't remember. So
We were going to talk about
let's,
Chaplin now.
yeah, we got to talk about Chaplin. So World War II ends. Oh yeah, that's the last thing I was going to say. That also means that like when the Allies and everybody are moving into Germany at the end, that also means that a lot of the concentration camps would have been liberated
Yeah.
during under that Venus retrograde that's happening in 1945 at the end of the war.
Yeah, the liberation of the camps is happening starting like January, February, so going into the retrograde. But certainly, yes, a lot of that is,
Mm.
um, and it's a startling revelation. In 1945, in April, I think Austin just mentioned this in your forecast episode, that it was Venus and Mercury retrograde in Aries in April of 1945, which is what
Mm.
makes it seem even more so like the period coming up, because Venus and Mercury are going retrograde this year within in less than 2 weeks of each other at virtually the same degree, and both of them are making the retrograde stations opposite the last solar eclipse, and the following solar eclipse is at the degree of the retrograde station. And then when Venus goes direct in April at 24 Pisces, that's the degree of the last lunar eclipse, and it'll be followed by a lunar eclipse that opposes it. So, yeah, there are some things about the end of the Second World War that remind me of the months to come in March and April of 2025.
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions, and that's why I'm researching this because we can see there's some like major geopolitical stuff that's about to go down in March and April in the world. And I'm trying to look at some of the past ones to see the positive as well as the negative precursors in terms of different things that have happened, including this retrograde. So one of the more positive things actually is that the war ended, and so there's a possible precedent for a war ending or some sort of liberation happening, like the 1945 Venus retrograde. But there are other less good ones as well, so we'll get into that later. So, all
Yes.
right, so let's switch to Chaplin. What was happening with Chaplin in 1945?
Okay. Well, I mean, another thing Chaplin and Hitler had in common is they seem to be around younger women quite a bit.
Oh yeah, that
Um,
actually just reminded me. Hitler didn't commit suicide alone. He
no,
got
with his
married. He got
yes, just
married.
before, and then shot her. Yeah, like almost right
Yeah,
away. Yeah.
and then committed suicide. So there's
Yeah.
like other little element there of the kind of fucked up romantic life of
Yeah.
Hitler that
Yeah.
has
Well,
then a parallel
yeah.
with what we're about to go into with Chaplin.
Yeah, I mean that's just it. There's a lot I could say about Hitler. We didn't have time to get into it. There are a number of young women. There are at least 7 young women who either tried or succeeded in ending their lives over him in some way. Eva Braun was his girlfriend, so to speak, but there were others, and one of them was Gelly Robal, who was his actual niece. And it was when she died in his apartment in 1931. People think, no one knows the total truth about the relationship, but whether it was sexual or not, it was certainly inappropriate. But she took her life in his apartment in 1931, almost a full Venus cycle before he invades Poland, like September of 31 to September of 39. And when she takes her life, that's when he becomes a vegetarian.
Hmm.
And there's a whole other. I don't want to get into the details, but Gelly Robal was born with Venus retrograde in Cancer and Jupiter in Leo, which is exactly what Hitler's mother had. Hitler's mother also had Venus retrograde in Cancer and Jupiter in Leo. So Gelly Robal's chart is also a strong mirror image of his mother. But we're really getting aside here. Long story
Right.
short, both Hitler and Chaplin have a thing for younger women in a very problematic context.
Right.
Um, I mean,
Mm.
Hitler's Hitler. So, in his case, it winds up not being the worst thing he's ever done. But that's just because he's Hitler. In Chaplin's case, I mean, Chaplin is, an otherwise, decent guy, but this is a real problem for him. His first wife was very young, maybe even under 18, and he married her because she was pregnant, and then there was a miscarriage, and the marriage fell apart. And then his second wife was also like a very young girl that he had gotten pregnant, and they got married, and they had two sons, one of whom was a few days older than his future fourth wife, but that's another matter coming up. And then that divorce ended like in a big scandalous divorce in the 1920s at a time when that was really embarrassing. This is another thing that sort of turned people against Chaplin was his scandalous personal life. He had a
Right.
reasonably good
Like this
third
was a
marriage.
recurring thing throughout his life is that his
Yeah,
um, inappropriate
yeah,
relationships with women that were way younger than him, even at that time, way back then, was viewed as scandalous, and that he got a lot of criticism for it and a lot of bad press. And this is one of the things that was happening still back, I think, under one of the like the 1929 retrograde already, that he was still dealing with the
the
um,
second
sk
divorce. Yeah, the second
yeah,
divorce. Yeah,
like
Lita
the
Gray. Yeah,
scandals.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
because actually, scandals is one of our Venus retrograde keywords just in general.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and that this clearly is Charlie's, Achilles heel, so to speak. He does wind up having a third marriage in the 30s that, although it doesn't last, it's with a woman who's relatively age appropriate, at least compared to the other three women he marries, and is amicable when it ends. Like it just ends because they're growing apart and not because it's, he's done something terrible or what have you. But then he finds himself sort of single again in the 40s, and he starts seeing this young woman. I think her name was Joan Barry. Of course, since he's this big film director and film star, the usual line is, "Hey, I'll put you in the movies." That old saw.
Hmm.
Um, Now, it turns out, I mean, the relationship just doesn't go well with this woman, but she seems to be well, I guess, at least as far as he's concerned, she comes off as unhinged. It may be that she's just, very angry at him for being, for rejecting her after she's given herself to him. But whatever
Right.
the truth of it all is, I mean, there is an episode like she, shows up on his lawn and is screaming at him, and there's all these different scenes. Eventually, what happens is she's pregnant, and she's going to sue him for, palimony. So there's this big court case. Now, remember, the court case happens in April of 1945. The Second World War is ending, and yet, like,
Hmm.
the Charlie Chaplin's palimony case with this young Joan Barry woman is, in the newspapers with photos and all this stuff. There's a big story in the middle of all this other stuff happening in the world, and
That there's this like huge scandal, and he's having a public downfall at the
public
same time
downfall.
that Hitler's
Yes.
having a public downfall.
Exactly. Yeah. Even though 1937, their lives seemed to, that the retrograde wasn't treating them necessarily the same way in an identifiable way. We're back to sort of the 1931, 1913 period in the sense that like the same thing is happening to both of them at the same time, but in their own context. Yeah, April of 1945 is just terrible for Charlie because he's in court trying to defend himself for having gotten this young woman pregnant and then abandoning her. But it gets even a little more insulting to him. Um, he takes a blood test and it's proven that he's not the child's father. But nonetheless, the judge, because Charlie's, wealthy and older and, entitled, and because Joan Barry is young and poor and has a child to feed, the judge nevertheless orders Charlie to pay child support for a child that is scientifically proven not to be his. Um, Some people might think that's fair. Some will not. Certainly, Charlie won't. And certainly, he's this is the low point in his life. Everything after this is by comparison better, even though he's got more suffering ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, so that's a really striking parallel in terms of both of those. And then he's also still continuing to come at, due to his outspoken political views, come under the focus of like the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover for suspicion about communist sympathies, because that's
Uh,
going to be actually the thing that happens immediately after World War II ends, is like then all of a
yeah,
sudden like the Cold War like begins pretty soon after that.
yeah. I mean, one thing leads to another. The Soviet Union, the USA have been allies up until that point, but suspicion sets in. The Soviets do one thing, the Americans do another. Everyone sort of doesn't trust the other. The Americans certainly don't trust Stalin. Um, so, with that in mind, by 1947, Hollywood's going through a big investigation. There's supposedly a lot of communists in Hollywood. They have this big hearing in Congress with what they call the Hollywood 10. These different screenwriters and film directors who have their own sort of tangential connections to the Communist Party, and a lot of people are blacklisted. This is part of how Ronald Reagan sort of rises up in the film industry, as he's the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and so he's kind of responsible for reporting on who what actors are which actors are communists or not. And the way he meets Nancy Reagan, her name was Nancy Davis at the time. There was another actress named Nancy Davis who was apparently an accused communist. And so the Nancy Davis who's going to become Nancy Reagan goes to Ronald Reagan, the president of Screen Actors Guild, and say, "Hey, I'm not that Nancy Davis. Please clear me." And so that's kind of Reagan's job as the president of Screen Actors Guild. So he's a part of all that. Nixon is a congressman who's making his name in the papers during this period in 47, 48. So long story short, yes, Chaplin has, quite open left-wing sympathies. I wouldn't say he's an out-and-out communist, but he's pretty damn close. He's definitely a fellow traveler. And Hoover has been gathering a file on him since the 20s. J. Edgar Hoover became the head of the FBI in 1924, and I think by then he's got his eye on Chaplin. So what happens is Chaplin makes another movie called Monsieur Verdoux about a sort of serial killer. It's quite good. He bought the idea off Orson Welles. That's in 1947. He marries the Una O'Neill, the daughter of Eugene O'Neill. She's 18 when she marries him. Fun twist is there was another man who wanted to marry her, and his name was J.D. Salinger, and he becomes very bitter, and his whole writing career is kind of based on the fact that Charlie Chaplin stole his girl. Um, anyway, he marries Una O'Neill. They have many children. I think like 7, 8, 9 children, something like that. Like a lot more than 5, well over 5. A few of them are well-known actors. One of them played her own grandmother. Geraldine Chaplin played her own grandmother in the movie Chaplin. She played Chaplin's mother in the movie with Robert Downey Jr. when he played Chaplin. Um, and what happens is he's going to go to Europe. He sails to Europe in late 1952, um, ostensibly just to travel, but he knows things are getting hot for him in the U.S. And I think he does know like his days are probably numbered. And what happens is in 1953 during the spring, he's in Europe, and he finds out that um, his he won't be allowed back into the U.S. He's been banned because of his communist sympathies. So
So
even though
so
he's been
this is
living there with
our
the yeah,
so this is our next Venus retrograde, is 1953 retrograde
correct.
in the spring in Aries, and
Yeah.
he tries to come, he's been in Europe, and then he tries to come back and he gets banned from re-entering the United States.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not sure if he tries to come back. He's just notified that, if and when he does, he'll be refused, is I think what happens. Or yeah, like he's already in Europe when he's informed that he's been banned from returning.
Right. In the notes, you say that he surrenders his US re-entry visa permit.
Yeah, because they demand it. I mean, it's not like it's a voluntary thing. They're like, give us your reentry permit. We're not going to accept it.
So, and the reason for that is because he's been accused of being a communist, basically at that point.
Yes, he's a communist, but also, as I mentioned earlier, he never became an
He's
American. He never
accused of
became
being
an
a
American citizen.
communist.
Yeah, but he also never became an American citizen, so it's really easy to ban him from the country. If he had become a citizen, he would have been. You couldn't ban him.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that, why did he do that? Was that deliberate on his part? What was the,
I don't think he probably just didn't give it much, sort of thought. You know, I
right.
mean, after all, like, I mean, think of where he's from. He's like, this British kid from the slums. He's not, yeah, I don't know. I can't pretend to know his motivation for that, but I can easily imagine that it's just something that he's not thinking about. He's thinking about making movies and meeting young women and playing tennis and going sailing. It's not, he's not thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, so it's 19, he originally went to Hollywood in 1913. He'd already been in the
Yeah.
States for 2 or 3 years up to that point. So we're talking about 1953 at this point. We're talking about
40
40,
years.
40
Yeah.
years later.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, how does he react to that, to being, kept out of the country that he had been living in for 40 years up to that point?
He's heartbroken. He's totally heartbroken. And yeah, basically a broken man. I mean, he's got a lot of money. He buys an estate in Switzerland and, raises his kids and settles down more or less. He does make a couple of more movies. Um, but it really breaks his heart. Um, and it's only 19, is it 19? Yeah, it's 19 years later. So like an eclipse cycle later, in the spring of 72, not during the Venus retrograde, but he's invited back to the US to accept an honorary Oscar. Funny enough, this happens like just before J. Edgar Hoover dies, like within a couple of weeks. So yeah, and this footage, this is what we were talking about earlier. When he accepts, he goes back to the U.S. thinking he's been forgotten, thinks no one cares about his movies anymore, and he goes to the Oscar ceremony, and he's sort of standing off stage as they're showing a
Is
reel of his film clips at the Oscar just before they bring him on stage. And
Hold
he
on just a
hears
sec.
bring him
The
out. He's now this
connection's
sort of,
cutting out.
old man. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hold on just a sec. The connection's cutting out, so I want to let it come back so you can tell that story. Okay. So hold on just a bit to back up. So 1953, he's barred from the US. Does this end
Yeah.
his film career entirely?
It doesn't end his film career, but it ends his film career in America. He does
Hmm.
make two or three more movies. He directs a movie with Marlon Brando and Elizabeth Taylor, if I remember correctly. He does a bit more, but not much. And he's kind of, by this point he's kind of an old man, so his sensibilities are not in touch with, the culture. His movies at this point come off as movies that are made by an old man who's kind of out of touch, I suppose. Although they're not bad in and of themselves. He's an artist. But yes,
Okay.
in April of 1972, 19 years after
What
he's
does he
been banned from
do
the.
in the intermediate time? So he kind of goes in, he makes a few more like small films, but otherwise he goes into semi-retirement at this point.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, he makes two or three more movies, each several years apart, so he's not like constantly working by any stretch of the imagination. Um, but yeah, he's basically living on an estate in Switzerland with his wife, and he's got a lot of kids, and yeah, just, living life as a retiree, I guess.
Sure, but he's exiled from the country that he'd been in for 40 years. So then
Yeah.
we jump forward almost 20 years to 1972, and this is not a Venus retrograde and Aries period, but it's nonetheless important in his biography.
It's important in his biography. It is in April of 1972, and Venus will go retrograde in Gemini like 6 weeks later or something like that. But it's not the one that we're talking about. But just to sort of put the story in context. He's invited back to America to accept an honorary Academy Award. And he at this point, he's been gone from the U.S. for almost 20 years, and he thinks everyone's forgotten him. He thinks he's a big has-been, and that no one really cares about him, and that they're just being, kind to an old man. But without, he doesn't think it's going to be that big a deal. But then he gets to California. He's at the Oscar ceremony, and he's backstage waiting for them to, invite him on stage to get his award. And they show a reel of his films, like just some great scenes from his films, which of course are brilliant. And the audience is just loving them. They're laughing their heads off, and they're applauding, and it's just a fantastic reception. And he comes out, and they give him this just glowing standing ovation, and he's so moved to tears. It's a very powerful moment, and you can just imagine, having lived there for 40 years, having been exiled for 20. It's a very, very moving moment. And obviously, he had clocked it wrong. He's still very much a big deal. There's kind of a renaissance in this period in the 70s of his films, and also of the Marx Brothers. They're sort of they've been gone so long, they become hip again in a way, and they're old enough that they can be cool. So yeah, there's kind of a renaissance. Although that's really it. He accepts his award, and then he goes back to Europe. Um, Charlie dies on Christmas Day in 1977. So he
By
did have,
by the way, hold on. By the way,
yeah.
in early like 69 during the Venus retrograde in Aries, that's
Oh,
when he started to like receive renewed recognition and honors. Um, that some of that shift may have started to happening at that point. And then during the one in 1961, he was writing his autobiography, or in 1961, he
right,
was writing his autobiography,
right,
and then would publish it later that same year of that retrograde in 1961.
right. I did know that. I have a copy of the book. That's the book where he tells us he's born at 8 o'clock p.m.
Okay. So just
Um,
filling in those two
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
um, retrogrades, that's really interesting that he was like in this 1961 Venus retrograde that he's reflecting on his life and literally like writing his autobiography and like thinking back and collecting all the things during that period. And
Yeah,
then possibly starting in the 1961, 69 one, he starts, there might be the move towards that shift of having a appraisal of his films and things like that in the new film era of the late 1960s and early 1970s.
yeah. I mean, part of it is, the film industry is going through this incredible transformation in 1969, 1970. Um, the kind of movies that had been big hits, that had been, surefire money makers, just weren't cutting it anymore. The culture had changed. And then Easy Rider's going to come out in 1969. And then, of course, The Godfather's going to come out in 72, around about the time that Chaplin comes to accept his award. And yeah, these movies and, French Connection and all these other auteur movies of the early 70s are really going to sort of signify the new Hollywood. But on top of all that, while the Hollywood studio system is crashing, Chaplin and the Marx Brothers are seen as these sort of evergreen talents, who were ahead of their time, who had anti-war and leftist messages. I mean, I remember being very small, my parents taking me to see the Marx Brothers Duck Soup, which is an anti-war movie. The hippies loved Duck Soup, and they loved Modern Times. Modern Times, suddenly the message was very contemporary and very sympathetic with the public, as it had not necessarily been with everyone in the 30s.
Right. It
Uh,
also makes me
uh,
think of some of those late 60s and early 70s writers who went to like film school and stuff like that and
yeah,
therefore would have studied
yeah.
the film and become very aware of like the role that Chaplin played and therefore he would have been elevated in their eyes, especially for the more like educated or like academically educated film school type people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's a great film director. He is a great performer, of course, but he's simply a visionary film director. He figured a lot of things out, for other people who followed him. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Film students would be seeing these movies and going, yeah, this is the real stuff. I don't care about, you know, these sappy musicals and romance movies that were coming out in the 40s and 50s. Those are square, but these old, Chaplin and Marx Brothers movies are really hip and visionary and of the times, of the era.
That's really funny because that's the other thing that does come up with Venus retrogrades is retro
Mm,
styles and
right.
like old artistic or like fashion styles sometimes come back from the past and they're because
Hmm.
all that was something I realized during the last Venus retrograde in Leo and Virgo is that all retrogrades have this backwards looking orientation and this past looking orientation of looking into the past. So that's interesting that that would make sense that part of that would be a looking back to the past in terms of film, and they would have found him right at the beginning of that,
Exactly. Exactly.
as well as not just even just to mention like him 8 years before that retrograde, like writing his autobiography and looking back and reviewing his own past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good book, that autobiography too. Yeah, it's one of the better ones I've read.
Okay. Um, so well, yeah, it would be a little tricky because I don't know how much he would whitewash like some of his personal life and some of that the
Yeah.
skeezy stuff in terms of that versus a more objective biography that probably would have been more in some ways more critical of some of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, of course. I don't read an autobiography thinking I'm getting, the whole story. I think I'm getting the story from the horse's mouth. And then
Mhm.
there are other books you can read to get, the fuller story, the one told from the outside as well from the inside. So yeah, I mean, you're right. That there is a limited value to that, and certainly he's going to tell you his version of the story and how he feels about things. But number one, that's really valuable to an astrologer. You can, you don't have to approve of a person's position in order to learn about how it's reflected by the horoscope. You know, um,
Right.
so
Yeah,
so
for sure.
they're yeah, yeah.
I
So
guess I'm
yeah, I
just
wouldn't.
thinking of perspectives and like,
Sure.
I
Yeah.
don't want to sit down and read like Mein Kampf to, get too much of a objective view about Hitler's, even though you can obviously gain a lot of stuff from that. I'm just thinking of the
Yeah.
different values of objective versus subjective autobiography and biography sometimes and the value of both
Sure.
for sure. But for sure,
Yeah.
reading an autobiography is super important for the subjective experience as well as the inside details of the actual native who lived it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're studying the life of Hitler, as one does, then sure, you do read Mein Kampf, but it's not, you don't read it because okay, well now I know everything I need to know about Hitler. No, it's telling you how Hitler thinks, how he expresses himself, what he's focused on, so that when you're studying the life, you have that part of, you have his testimony. I mean, that's what these books are for these men. I mean, it's their testimony, and you take it, as one does. But certainly, I've read, probably a dozen books about Hitler, that were not Mein Kampf, that told me way more than Mein Kampf would. I haven't read Mein Kampf cover to cover, but I have perused it for exactly that reason. I mean, if you're studying his life, as I do, um, I study the lives of people that I admire, like Chaplin. I study the lives of people that I detest, frankly, like Hitler. It's still a worthwhile study. And it's still worth reading those works, but certainly it's not like you don't want to base your whole perspective and your knowledge of the person solely on those works. They're one contribution that can add something to what you're putting together, something valuable, but by no means the whole picture.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then just to
Yeah.
bring this story to a close, well, it didn't happen during the retrograde. He actually ended up dying like later the same
Yes.
year of the next Venus retrograde in Aries. So,
Yeah.
um,
I
in
do have a, I do,
1977.
Yeah, I do have a story relating to that. I don't have the specific date or the event, so I didn't give you a chart. But he dies Christmas Day of 1977, which is about 8, 9 months, whatever, after the Venus retrograde in the spring of 77. What I do know is he apparently the last time he appeared in public was at a circus. He just went to see a circus as a spectator. But they sort of announced his presence in the audience. He's very old at this point. Geez, he must have been what, 89, I guess. Sorry, 88. Of course, he just turned 88. Um, and so he stood up. He apparently did like a little dance, something whatever an 88-year-old could muster to entertain a circus crowd, but he put on like a little,
Little
quick little show to
little
acknowledge the applause he was getting. Yeah.
little YMCA dance like that.
Yeah, maybe. I'm
Yeah,
sure, better than the current dancers to that song.
sure.
Although it was probably, getting ready to hit the hit parade in the spring of 77. Um, so yeah, long story short, I believe he made his last basically public appearance during that Venus retrograde in the spring of 77 before he died on Christmas Day.
Wow, that's incredible. All right.
Yeah.
So his story ends up closing down in 1977 in a Venus retrograde in Aries year as well. That really takes us through, yeah, most of this list of Venus retrogrades over the course of the past century.
Yeah.
So that's incredible. So obviously, there's more to be researched there. There's probably more things. There's other things probably about some of the retrogrades that probably we don't know about or could have happened, especially in terms of like internal things, in terms of relationships, in terms of different subjective things that we may not be aware of trying to study somebody's biography from the outside. But even from our limited standpoint, with both of these figures, we can see how they both, their lives were tied in very closely to this specific Venus retrograde sequence. So that's really striking, both as an instance of time twins, of which I'm
Yeah.
sure there's like many other
Oh yeah.
instances out there, but also as a good example of how those 8-year Venus retrograde repetitions can sometimes weave throughout a person's biography and tie in very important turning points in terms of their overall life story.
Yeah, exactly right. And thank you for letting me tell this particular story. Like I said, it was one of the first ones that I was looking at when I really stumbled across the Venus synodic cycle and how it operates in this way. So it's kind of very close to the origin of all this for me personally. And yeah, it's a compelling example. I guess also just because it's Chaplin and Hitler. I mean, Chaplin certainly had some flaws that anyone would disapprove of, but there's no questioning his the legacy of his art, which was considerable, and that I've always really appreciated. And so the contrast, obviously, with this monster. Is also just intriguing to follow them through their course and see all the parallels relating to the cycles that emerge in both their lives relative to each of their contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up the whole issue of like that's discussed so much these days of how much can you separate like the art from the artist and like
Yeah,
how much does the person's personal life, which can be egregiously bad as it was in Chaplin's instance, and yet still studying the broader context of their let's say pioneering work in terms of
yeah,
the history of like cinema and things like that, um, and how those two things in his instance actually intertwined because his personal life and personal views and personal um, shortcomings and bad things really did in some instances impact the course of his career and his you know contributions to film history and things like that. So
yeah.
there was an intertwining there between those two things.
Absolutely. I mean, you couldn't blame anyone for deciding to just not watch his films because his personal life was just objectionable. That's an understandable choice. I guess, for my part, I saw his movies as a kid, so I was seduced before I could really understand or make that kind of call. And also the conversation was very different when I was young. But yeah, I guess whatever conclusion one comes to, I mean, this is the thing. I don't, I'm not an amoral person, but when I'm studying astrology, because I do study, monsters and then other people who are not, Um, there is some kind of neutral tone I adapt just to study the life and have a space where I'm not thinking about whether the person's good or bad, but just trying to understand how they see the world, what they're trying to accomplish. Are they successful or failure at that? How do the transits, serve them or work against them? And yeah, there is a sort of surgical level to doing this that you don't necessarily want to jump into, the pool and participate in the sort of the human level of what you're looking at, but you're sort of, as an astrologer, you are looking down on the situation. You're sort of removed from the whole scenario, especially if you're studying something historical where everyone involved is dead. Um,
Yeah, for sure. I just don't
so
want
yeah, yeah,
the objective study of history and the applying from a technical standpoint of astrological style cycles to be misconstrued as like an endorsement or something like that, which
yeah,
obviously it's not to us when we study these different biographies of famous dictators and like mass murderers or even like serial killers or other things like that, versus yeah, it's the sort of personal
yeah,
judgments that a person makes in terms of ethical and moral things. But this is one of the reasons why Venus retrogrades are tricky to study because that's one of the things that comes up is that we do have like scandals, we do have like questionable moral
yeah,
or social
yeah,
things. We have taboos is one of the keywords I realized was a
yeah.
good one earlier when we were talking about this because taboo is a good one because it's relative to society and whatever the
The
societal
social code. Yeah, yeah,
right, whatever the social standards are at the time, sometimes Venus retrogrades can bring up taboos or people that trespass or cross taboos, whatever those are, which may shift in or be different in different societies or may shift in different time periods. But nonetheless, relative to that time period, Venus can sometimes set up like a consensus, and then sometimes Venus retrograde suddenly turns and walks the opposite direction and breaks social convention, sometimes for better or worse. And sometimes this can be in a very like pioneering, sort of progressive way in terms of like art and culture or politics or other things like that. And other times it can be in a not good way or in a regressive way or in a trying to think of other keywords, but in a way that's like inappropriate or other things like that.
absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, just to come back to the astrologer's role in all of this. I think like especially the level to which I get to with these biographical studies where they're very detailed and sort of intimate. Um, I liken it to say if you're a medical practitioner who's doing an autopsy, and you're cutting open a body and you're taking out organs and weighing them on the scale and reporting the weight of the lungs or whatever into a little recorder. Everything I know about autopsies I learned on TV, of course, but that's my impression of how it's done. But the point is, I mean, of course, there's a corpse in front of you who was once a living human being. There's all kinds of tragic connotations. It might even be the body of a child or something horrible like that. But your job is to, do the autopsy and not think about those things in that moment. You're still a human being. You might think about them later or just in your everyday life. There are things that impact you. But when you're in the act of doing the job, you're not thinking about these things. It could be the body of some dictator in front of you that you loathe, or it could be, like I said, the body of a child who died tragically. Either way, you have a job to do to sort of you know get the job done and not let those things impact you at that time.
Mhm.
um, and so that's how I see this kind of historical work. It's not, I have very strong opinions about Adolf Hitler, you know, um, and none of them are good. I have people in my family who, disappeared on a train to Kiev, never to be seen again, and those impacted my grandfather. So, I mean, I'm touched the way a lot of people are. Um, so it's not so much that it's besides the point, but when I'm doing the astrology thing and I'm looking at a life, I can't be like, oh yes, this nasty person, did this and did that. I have to be looking at the chart through the person's perspective.
Mhm.
Think of it more like, I guess another sort of metaphor is the detective who's doing who's thinking, you're trying to catch, say, a serial killer, and you're trying to think like the serial killer in order to catch the serial killer. To do that, you have to first think like the serial killer. So there's an element of that in what I'm doing. You're not, becoming someone awful, but you are trying to look at the perspective of different people, how they see the world, including people who are monsters. So I just see it as being part of what we do, and there has to be a certain um, yeah, a certain sort of game face that you have when you're doing it, I think.
Right,
Does
for
that make
sure.
sense? I hope that's understood.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's good. Cool.
All right.
So I think this went really well. I think this was good coverage. It's a nice, concise coverage of covering just those specific Venus retrograde periods. So we're going to continue doing some research and do a follow-up because there's lots of other interesting history with this specific Venus retrograde in Aries. So yeah, we're going to do some follow-ups in order to look at it in other world events and other histories and things like that to continue to provide some context for this upcoming Venus retrograde. But I think this is a nice start. So thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for having me and giving me the chance to talk about this. It's an old classic.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely one of your greatest hits. So where can you do consultations? Where can people find out more information
Yeah.
about your work?
Yeah, I'm doing consultations regularly. I can be booked at nickdaganbestastrologer.com/consultations, or just go to nickdaganbestastrologer.com and press the consultation tab. Yeah, I'm available for that. I love doing it, and of course, I'm part of the team that's building the Chepso astrology software that we're expecting to be launched into the world very soon. Very exciting. The things I'm seeing every day is new developments, new things, different parts are moving parts are attached and come to life. So it's pretty mind blowing software, and I can't wait for everyone to see it. So I'm just putting that out there as well.
Nice, awesome. And you also have a YouTube channel where you have some other videos on Venus retrogrades where I guess people can just search for your name, Nick Dagan Best, on YouTube and they'll
Yeah,
find a bunch of good videos.
that's right. My channel is just called Nick Dagan Best, and I do have I'm planning to make a lot more videos. I've been sidetracked by the software making, but there are a bunch coming out. But I made a video about 2 years ago, 2 years ago, called "The Introduction to the Venus Synodic Cycle," and yeah, if you see that video, it's about 10 minutes long, and it just sort of explains the way I've broken down the cycle into this system that I use now. Um, that allows me to sort of study the Venus cycle over long periods of time that isn't merely attached to the zodiac, but follows the cycle itself. So it's worth learning, very useful for astrologers. In my opinion, every astrologer should know the Venus cycle by heart. It's not hard to learn, um, and really, really useful in every context, and as a consulting astrologer, as a researcher, in every facet, it's really fundamental. You got to know it.
Yeah, I think we've certainly demonstrated like why that is here in this
Yeah.
episode. And then in the last Venus retrograde in 2023, I did a series of episodes. So if people want to learn more about Venus retrogrades, they can also check out our past episodes. So you, me, and Patrick did one in episode 405 of the astrology podcast called Venus Retrograde and Astrology Explained. That's a very good like overview episode. Um, Excellent episode, episode 412 with Demetra George that was titled Anana, Venus Retrograde, and Barbie, where
Oh
we
yeah.
talked about how the Barbie movie came out like the day that Venus stationed retrograde in Leo and how it actually contained weirdly like the archetype of this ancient Sumerian and Babylonian story about Venus
Right.
retrogrades connected with the goddess Inanna. And then I also did episode 410, which was titled Sharing Venus Retrograde Stories, where a bunch of people like shared their stories of Venus retrogrades, and there were some repetitions in that. So good to listen to for more info. And then you and me, Nick, are going to record a follow-up here very soon to this episode on Venus retrograde, specifically in Aries. So I'll release that for early access to patrons through my page on Patreon as soon as it's recorded, just like I'm doing for this episode, which is going to be available like days or like a week before I release it to the public. So people can sign up for that for more information. Thanks for joining me, Nick.
My pleasure, Chris. Yeah, sign up for his Patreon because I just had a client the other day who said I should be on the Astrology podcast more often. I said, do you know I'm on every month on the secret episode that's available to patrons only? And this person said, no, I didn't know that. I'm going to sign up right now. So yeah, if you like having me on the show, there's more Nick behind the curtain if you pony up. So do
Yeah, well,
that.
speaking of, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot that was an episode we just recorded a research session where you and I were talking through Russian history and this specific Venus retrograde in Aries and seeing how important it was for important turning points in the past few centuries of Russian history. So that episode is available exclusively to patrons of the Astrology podcast as an episode of the Secret Astrology podcast right now. So people can check that out for more information. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode. So thanks a lot for joining me. Thanks everyone for watching this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly electional astrology podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Chaplin, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, and Ginger Sadlier. If you're looking for an astrological consultation, then see the new list of recommended astrologers we have on the podcast website at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use on the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program Astro Gold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. If you're looking to study astrology more deeply, then check out my Hellenistic astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures that are unique to the course, and there's also a monthly webinar and Q&A session, and at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, thanks to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. And tickets for the in-person conference are sold out, but you can still get tickets for their virtual conference, which is being streamed live online simultaneously at norwac.net.